The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in a cloud of alkali dust that tasted like pulverized bone. The woman who stepped down called herself Sarah Smith. She was the only passenger to disembark at Sable Ridge, a town that seemed held together by little more than heat, brown paint, and the mutual desperation of its inhabitants. She kept her head down, the brim of her frayed bonnet casting a shadow over the yellowing bruise on her temple. The mark was shaped like a thumb, a final reminder from the man she had left bleeding in the dust 300 miles back. Her eyes, when she risked looking up, were the color of fear. They scanned the single street, a rutted track flanked by wooden sidewalks of uneven planking, the livery, the general store, the land office, and the largest building, the two-story structure with the bat-wing doors and the sound of a poorly tuned piano already leaking out at 10 in the morning. The Gilded Spur Saloon. She had $2.40, a change of clothes in a carpet bag, and a name that was not her own. She needed work, and she needed a room where she could lock the door. The saloon offered both. The owner, Silas Croft, was a man whose waistcoat was stained with what she hoped was tobacco. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the worn fabric of her dress and the thinness of her wrists. He saw a stray, and strays worked cheap. "You done this work before?" he grunted. "Yes, sir," she lied. "Rooms upstairs are filthy. Barrels need emptying. Floors need scrubbing. Pay is 50 cents a day, plus a room in the back. Room ain't much." "It will do, sir. You ain't afraid of hard work, are you?" Clara thought of the past 2 years, of the things she had endured, the things she had done. "No, sir, I'm not afraid of work." He spat a stream of brown juice into a nearby spittoon. "Room 12, at the end of the hall. It's the small one. Mops by the back door." Her new life began with the smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. The room was barely a closet, containing a narrow cot, a bucket, and a single window that looked out onto the alley. But the lock on the door, flimsy as it was, felt like a fortress. Sable Ridge was an unforgiving mirror. The land around it was cracked and dry, thirsty for a rain that never seemed to come. The wind was constant, a high, thin whine that picked at the buildings and drove grit into her eyes and mouth. It was a place where things came to die or to hide. Clara was hiding. The heat of the high desert was relentless, baking the wood of the town until it cracked. At night, the temperature plummeted, and the silence was vast, broken only by the distant, sharp yipping of coyotes. The sound always made her start, her hand flying to her throat. She settled into a rhythm of anonymity. Wake before dawn, haul water, scrub the main floor of the saloon, wiping away the filth of the night before. Empty spittoons, a job that made her stomach clench every single time. Change the linens in the few rooms upstairs that were rented by traveling salesmen or drifters. She worked with her head down, her voice a ghost. She was Sarah, the cleaning girl. She was invisible. The men who frequented the Gilded Spur treated her as part of the furniture. They spoke around her, over her, and sometimes at her, but rarely to her. Their requests were gruff, their glances either dismissive or assessing in a way that made her skin crawl. She learned the town by its sounds, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the slow creak of wagon wheels, the sudden, explosive laughter from the saloon's card tables. Every loud voice made her flinch. A boot stomping on the floorboards above her head was enough to send her heart racing. A sudden touch was agony. One afternoon, a cowboy, drunk on midday whiskey, grabbed her arm as she passed with a tray of dirty glasses. "Where you rushing off to, little mouse?" he'd slurred. Clara froze. The glasses trembled in her hands. She did not speak, did not breathe. The memory of another hand, a heavier hand, clamped over her mouth, suffocating her, rose up and stole her voice. She could only stare, wide-eyed, until Silas Croft barked from the bar. "Leave her be. Amos, she's working." The man released her with a shove, laughing. "Ain't no fun in that one." That night, Clara locked her door and sat on her cot for 2 hours, shaking in the dark. The small, sharp skinning knife she'd taken from the dead man's belt was under her pillow. She slept with her hand curled around its wooden grip. It was her only companion. About a month after she arrived, a new man rode into town. He did not arrive on the stagecoach, but on a tall buckskin horse that looked as steady and worn as he did. He tied the horse outside the general store, not the saloon. He moved with a deliberation that set him apart from the twitchy drifters and loud ranchers. His hat was gray, faded by years of sun. His clothes were plain, functional, and clean. His name, she heard the land agent call him, was Elias Trent. He was there to buy a small spread of land up by the creek, a place most folks considered too modest. He wanted to settle. They said, after years of drifting cattle up from Texas, he was done with moving. He entered the saloon later that day, not for whiskey, but for a meal. The bat-wing doors swung open, letting in a rectangle of blinding white sunlight. He paused, letting his eyes adjust. Clara was on her knees, scrubbing a stubborn stain near the piano. He saw her, a small, dark shape huddled on the floor. He saw her, and then he looked away, taking a seat at a table in the corner, far from the bar. He ordered beef stew and coffee. He ate slowly, his gaze moving over the room, the maps he'd spread on his table, and sometimes the window. Clara felt his presence more than she saw it. He was a weight in the room, a point of stillness. He did not yell for service. He did not slam his cup down. When she refilled his coffee, he did not try to look down her dress or brush his hand against hers. He just nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, startling second. His eyes were the color of the sky just before dawn, a deep, clear gray. He said nothing, but his silence was different from the silence of the other men. Theirs was the silence of dismissal. His was the silence of consideration. Elias Trent stayed in town, finalizing the deed to his land. He took a room at the saloon, as it was the only place that rented them weekly. Clara was terrified he would be given a room near hers, but he was put on the main floor. In room 4, he saw how she was treated. He saw Silas Croft dock her pay by 10 cents because she broke a glass when a gunshot went off in the street. He saw a traveling salesman pinch her back as she bent to clear a table, and saw the look of pale, frozen endurance on her face. Elias watched, and he learned. He learned that she never smiled. He learned that she moved along the walls of rooms as if trying to blend into the wood. He learned that her hands, though rough and red from lye soap, trembled almost constantly. One evening, he approached the bar where she was polishing glasses, her back to the room. The saloon was quiet, caught in the lull between the end of the workday and the start of the night's gambling. "Ma'am." His voice was low, pitched just for her. Clara startled so badly she nearly dropped the glass. She spun around, her hand flying to her chest, her breath caught. He stood 6 feet away, his hat in his hand. He did not move closer. "I apologize. I didn't mean to startle you." She just stared, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I need clean linens for room 4. He said, "When you have a moment. There's no hurry." "Yes, sir," she whispered. It was the first time a man had ever implied her time was her own. He nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "Thank you." He turned and walked out. He had not touched the bar. He had not leaned in. He had kept his distance. He had looked her directly in the eye, and his gaze held no judgment, no hunger, and no cruelty. It held only a quiet, steady awareness. Clara had to lean against the bar. Her legs felt weak. She had built a wall inside herself, a high, thick defense against the world of men. It was built to withstand battering rams, to deflect cruelty and absorb insults. It was not built for gentle courtesy. His quiet respect was a strange and terrifying thing, a crack in the stone she did not know how to repair. She kept her guard up, more fiercely now. She avoided him. When she saw him in the dining area, she busied herself in the kitchen. When she had to deliver the linens, she waited until she heard him leave for the land office, slipping into his room like a thief, changing the sheets, and fleeing before he returned. But she felt his eyes on her. When she worked, she could feel his steady, non-judgmental gaze from his corner table. He watched her, not like a hawk watches a mouse, but like a man watches the horizon, patiently. Just watching. It unnerved her more than any leering glance. She was drawn to it, to the sense of calm that rolled off him, even as she told herself that calm was a lie. All men were the same underneath. Kindness was just a slower, sharper trap. The night it happened was a Saturday. The gilded spur was loud, thick with smoke and the smell of sweat and spilled whiskey. A crew from the Double Bar Ranch had just been paid, and they were spending their wages with loud, drunken enthusiasm. Clara was run off her feet, hauling empty bottles, mopping up spills, trying to stay out of the way of the stumbling, laughing men. By midnight, she was exhausted, her bones aching. Silas sent her to clear the trash from the back, a task she hated. The alley was dark, lit only by the faint yellow light spilling from the back door and a sliver of moon. The air was blessedly cool. She dumped the bucket of refuse into the large wooden bin and leaned against the wall for just a second, closing her eyes, savoring the quiet. Well, looky here. Her eyes snapped open. A man stepped out from the deep shadows by the rain barrel. He was big, backlit, a freighter she'd seen drinking at the bar for the past 2 days. His name was Jed. "You're mistaken, sir," she said automatically, her voice trembling as she pushed away from the wall. He took a step, blocking her path to the door. He smelled of cheap rye and grime. "Oh, I ain't mistaken," he slurred, a grin splitting his beard. "I never forget a face, especially not one as pretty as yours. Took me a day to place you." Clara's blood ran cold. "Please, I have to get back to work." He lunged, grabbing her arm in a grip of iron. The pain was immediate and sharp. "You're a long way from Dodge City, ain't you?" Her world stopped. The sound of the piano, the laughter from inside, it all faded away. There was only the hot, whiskey-sour breath of this man, his fingers digging into the flesh of her upper arm. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, terror making her voice thin. "Don't you?" He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "I was there. I was hauling freight for Bartholomew Griggs himself. I saw you. You was his woman. Kept you in that fancy house on the hill." He pulled her closer, his face just inches from hers. "Clara, that's the name. Clara Bellamy." The name was a gunshot. It was a sentence. She stopped fighting, frozen by the sound of her own ghost. "Heard you killed him," Jed breathed, his eyes glittering in the dark. "A whore and a killer. What do you suppose old Silas would pay to know that, or the sheriff?" He yanked her hard, pulling her off balance. "Maybe you and me can come to an arrangement." She found her voice, a high, thin scream of "No!" and began to fight, twisting and kicking, but he was too strong. He clamped his other hand over her mouth, and the familiar suffocating panic surged. "That's enough. Jed." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the night like a freshly honed blade. It came from the mouth of the alley. Elias Trent stood there, a solid silhouette against the streetlights. He hadn't drawn his gun. His hands were loose at his sides. Jed froze, his hand still clamped over Clara's mouth. "This ain't your business. Trent, this is between me and this little murderin' bit." "The lady seems to think it is," Elias said, his voice still level, still calm. He took one slow step into the alley. "Let her go." "Or what? You gonna draw on me?" "Cowboy," Jed sneered. But there was a new tremor of uncertainty in his voice. He still held Clara as a shield. "I'd prefer not to," Elias said. "But I will. You're drunk. I'm not." "That's a poor wager for you." He took another step. He was close enough now that the light from the back door caught the steady gray of his eyes. "Let her go! Walk away!" The tension stretched thin. Clara could feel Jed's heart hammering against her back. He was weighing the cost of a fight against the pleasure of his cruelty. Elias just waited, unmoving, a promise of violence held perfectly in check. With a sudden, vicious curse, Jed shoved Clara to the ground. She fell hard, her hands and knees scraping on the hard-packed, filthy dirt. "She ain't worth the lead anyway." Jed spat. He glared at Elias, then hitched his trousers and stumbled past him, disappearing into the darkness of the street. The alley was suddenly, profoundly silent. There was only the sound of the distant piano and Clara's own ragged breathing. Elias did not move toward her. He waited. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle again. "You all right, ma'am?" He called her ma'am, not Sarah, not Clara. She couldn't answer. She was shaking too hard to stand, the imprint of Jed's hand still burning on her face. He had heard. He had heard her name. He knew. The safety she had built, the invisible life, was gone. Shattered in a single moment. She pushed herself up, stumbling, and scrambled past him. She did not look at him. She could not. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Before he could say another word, before he could ask the question that she saw forming in his eyes, she fled. She ran back into the noise and the light of the saloon, grabbing a cleaning rag, her hands moving, wiping a table that was already clean, desperate to lose herself in the motion, to pretend that the man in the alley and the name he had spoken did not exist. Elias stood in the alley for a long time, watching the empty space where she had been. He looked down at the scuffed dirt where she had fallen. Then he walked back to the street, his expression thoughtful. The next morning, he was at the saloon for breakfast. Clara served him, her hands trembling so badly she nearly spilled his coffee. She would not meet his eye. She looked paler, more brittle, like a dry leaf about to crumble. He accepted the coffee, his gaze steady on her face. He did not mention the night before. Later that day, Elias found the dayman, Henry, polishing the bar. "That woman," Elias said quietly, nodding toward the kitchen where Clara had disappeared. "The one who cleans, Sarah." Henry grunted. "What about her? Where'd she come from?" "Dunno." Henry shrugged, wiping a cloth in a slow circle. "Silas hired her a month, maybe 6 weeks back. Drifted in on the stage. Keeps to herself. Works hard." Elias leaned against the bar. Casual. "She ever mention where she came from? Ever mention Dodge City?" Henry stopped wiping. "Dodge? No, she don't never mention anything. Barely speaks 2 words all day. Why you asking about Dodge?" Elias pushed a coin across the bar for his coffee. "Just curious," he said, his voice mild. He walked out into the hot afternoon sun. He knew Jed hadn't been lying. He knew the terror in her eyes was real, and he knew that Sarah Smith, the quiet, fearful woman who scrubbed floors and slept with a knife, was hiding from something far worse than a drunk in an alley. The pieces of her story didn't add up, and the piece that was missing had a name: Clara Bellamy. The alley incident hollowed Clara out. Where before there was fear, now there was a brittle, echoing dread. The name. He had heard her name. Jed knew. And the cowboy. Elias Trent. He had heard it too. For 3 days, she was a ghost, flinching not just at loud noises, but at the sound of her own breathing. She scrubbed the floors with a frantic energy, as if she could wipe her own existence from the boards. She expected Elias to be gone, to have ridden out to his new land, to have put the trouble of a haunted saloon girl behind him. But he did not leave. He was there for breakfast, his hat on the peg by the door, the morning light catching the gray in his temples. He was there for supper, long after the heat of the day had broken. He did not move from room 4. He seemed to have suspended his plans. He was buying supplies, yes, sacks of flour and beans, new rope, a keg of nails, but he stored them at the livery, not at his land. And he came to the saloon. He did not come for whiskey, or for the sour company of the gamblers. He came, took his corner table, and drank coffee. He would sit for 2 hours, sometimes reading a week-old copy of the Cheyenne Daily Leader, sometimes mending a piece of his harness, the leather dark and supple in his large, steady hands. He was just there, a fixed point in her spinning, terrified world. He never called her Clara. He never mentioned Jed. He never spoke of Dodge City. When she approached his table, her hand trembling so violently she nearly scalded him, he would look up and nod. "Ma'am," he'd say, or sometimes, "Miss Smith." His voice was low, and it never carried. It was for her alone. He treated her like a person, not an equal, precisely, for she was a servant and he was a customer, but with a dignity that was so foreign it was like a new language. He did not stare at her body. He did not raise his voice. He watched her. Yes, his gray eyes missing nothing, but it was not the look of a predator. It was the look of a man who was waiting. Clara was torn. A part of her, the wild, hunted part, screamed at her to run. He knew he was a man. He would use this somehow. Men always did. They waited. They were patient. And when you were at your weakest, they used what they knew to take what they wanted. But another part of her, a smaller, starved thing, was drawn to his stillness. He was the first man in her memory who had ever used his strength to protect her, not to harm her. He had faced down Jed with nothing but his voice and his presence. He had not drawn a gun. He had not thrown a punch. He had simply intervened. She began to orbit him. Like a comet drawn to a sun it dared not approach. She would find reasons to be in his corner of the room, wiping tables that were already clean, sweeping floors that were already bare. She found herself listening to his quiet interactions. "Just coffee, Henry," he'd say to the day man. "Heard you're having trouble with that well you dug," Silas Croft remarked one afternoon, leaning on the bar. Elias nodded, not looking up from his paper. "Water's hard, but it's there." "Place needs a woman's touch," Silas offered, his eyes sliding toward Clara. Elias folded his paper very slowly. He placed it on the table. His gaze lifted, not to Clara, but to Silas. His voice was flat. "My place needs fence posts and a new roof on the barn. That's all it needs right now." Silas, seeing no purchase, grunted and moved away. Clara felt the exchange like a physical shield. He had protected her again, without even looking at her. One sweltering afternoon, the saloon was empty save for the two of them. The heat had driven everyone to shade. Even the piano was silent. Clara was sweeping, the rhythmic scrape of the broom on the wood the only sound. "You miss a spot." His voice startled her. She froze, looking at the floor. "Right there," he said. He wasn't mocking. He pointed with his boot. "By the table leg. Dust settles there fierce." She moved, her body stiff, and swept the spot. "Hard work," he said, more to himself than to her. "Keeping a place like this clean, it's a tide you can't ever turn back." She paused, her hands tight on the broom handle. "You just have to sweep it again tomorrow." The words were out before she could stop them. They were the most she had said to him, to anyone, in weeks. He looked at her, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. "That's the truth of it," he said. He returned to his coffee, but the air had changed. A thread had been cast. A few days later, he was working on his saddle, a piece of stamping tooling in his hand. He seemed frustrated, his brow furrowed. Clara, delivering a pot of fresh coffee, hesitated. The stitching is coming loose on your cantle," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, surprised she'd spoken, and then surprised at her words. He turned the saddle over. "So it is. My hands are too big for this needlework. Always make a mess of it." I can fix it," she said. The floorboard suddenly seemed the most interesting thing in the world. I'm good with a needle. My mother taught me. He was silent for a long moment. She thought she had overstepped, that he would refuse, or worse, laugh. I'd be mighty grateful, Miss Smith, he said, his voice soft. I have an awl and thread in my saddlebags. That evening, for an hour before the saloon filled, they sat, not inside, but on the bench outside the general store, under the wooden awning. The sun was low, painting the dust in the street a deep gold. He gave her the saddle, the awl, and the waxed thread. He sat on the edge of the boardwalk, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the shing, 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 a steady, peaceful rhythm. Clara bent her head to the work. Her hands, which trembled so badly when she carried glasses, were steady now. The needle was sure. The lye soap had ruined her skin, but it had not stolen her skill. She focused on the task, the pull of the thread through the holes, the neat, tight pattern she was weaving. It felt good. It felt normal. They did not talk for a long time. The silence was comfortable. It was not the loaded, threatening silence of the saloon, but the vast, open silence of the prairie. You're good at that, he said, testing the edge of his knife with his thumb. It's just sewing, she murmured. No, he said. It's mending. There's a difference. Mending takes more than just skill, takes patience, takes seeing what's broken and knowing how to make it strong again. She looked up, startled by the depth in his words. He was watching her, his gray eyes clear. She felt exposed, as if he were talking about something more than leather. She quickly looked back down at her work. My PA used to say. He continued, his voice rambling, easy. That you can judge a man by his tack, not by how new it is, but by how well it's kept, shows he values what he's got. He sounds like a smart man. He was. Elias said, he was also stubborn. Died trying to pull a calf from a bog in a blue norther. Froze to death before we found him. Clara stopped sewing. She looked at his hands, at the calluses and the old scars. She looked at his face, etched with lines from the sun and the wind. He was a man who knew loss. I'm sorry, she whispered. He nodded, accepting her words. It was a long time ago. Taught me that stubbornness is a fine thing, till it's the only thing you've got. He was giving her a piece of himself. She did not know what to do with it. She finished the stitching, knotted the thread, and handed the saddle back to him. He inspected the work, his fingers tracing the strong, new seam. This is better than new, he said. Stronger. I'm in your debt, ma'am. It was nothing, she said, gathering her things, desperate to retreat. It was something, he countered, his voice firm but kind. She fled back to the saloon, her heart a confusing mix of warmth and terror. He began to seek her out for these quiet moments. He'd ask her opinion on a bolt of cloth at the general store. My land, he'd say. The cabin there is bare, needs curtains. What color do you think would hold up to the dust? She would stand, frozen, by the bolts of calico. Brown or a dark blue? The light colors, they'll show the dirt too fast. Dark blue. He'd nod, as if she'd solved a great problem. That's a good thought. One evening, just as the sun was touching the horizon, he found her shaking out rugs in the alley. Come, he said, not a request or an order, just a statement. There's something you should see. Wary. She followed him. He walked past the livery, past the edge of town, to a small rise that overlooked the river. The water was low, a silver ribbon in the twilight. On the far bank, a herd of wild horses, maybe 20 or 30, had come to drink. Their silhouettes were sharp against the blazing orange sky. They stood, side by side, and watched. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of sage and clean water. They're beautiful, she whispered, her first unguarded words. They are, Elias agreed. They're free, nothing telling them where to go or what to do. Just the land, and the water, and the wind. She watched them, a fierce, painful longing rising in her chest. She wanted to be them. She wanted to run until her lungs burned, to run until she left her own skin, her own name, her own past, behind in the dust. The raw, endless landscape felt like a reflection of her own soul, empty, harsh, but with a wild, desperate beauty. She felt a kinship with this land, with these horses, and with the man standing silently beside her. He, too, seemed to have a piece of that wildness in him, a stillness learned from years of watching empty horizons. She felt a pull, a dangerous, undeniable desire, not just for his body, but for his calm, for the safety he offered, for the way he looked at her, as if she were not Sarah the cleaning girl or Clara the murderer, but just a woman. The thought terrified her. She turned and walked back to town, almost at a run. He sensed her pulling away. The next day, she was cold. She avoided his table, sending Henry to serve him instead. She was short-tempered, brittle. She told herself he was a fool, a good man, and she was poison. To let him get close, to let him care, was the cruelest thing she could do. He was building a life, a home. She was a fugitive. She would only bring him ruin. He was too good to be touched by her. Elias watched her retreat. He saw the panic in her eyes, the self-loathing that tightened her mouth, and he let her go. He didn't push. He kept his routine. He drank his coffee. He mended his gear. He waited. He was as patient as the seasons. Then the storm came. It had been building all day, the air thick and yellow, a heavy, oppressive stillness that made the saloon feel like a tomb. Just after sundown, the sky broke open. It was not a gentle rain. It was a high-country deluge, a violent assault of wind and water. The first crack of thunder was not a rumble, but a deafening explosion, as if a cannon had gone off on the roof. Clara was holding a tray of whiskey glasses. At the sound, she dropped it. The crash of glass was lost in the roar of the wind, but every man at the bar turned. She stood frozen, her face as white as bleached bone, her hands at her sides, shaking. Another flash of lightning lit the room in a stark, blue-white glare, followed immediately by another crack of thunder that rattled the very foundations of the building. Clara made a sound, a small, strangled gasp. It was the sound of an animal in a trap. Her eyes were wide, unseeing. She was not in the saloon. She was somewhere else. She was in a dark room, the sound of a man's voice, roaring like the thunder, the flash of his hand, striking like the lightning. "Sarah, clean this mess up!" Silas roared from the bar. But she couldn't hear him. She turned, her movements jerky, and fled. Not to her room. She ran out the back door, into the heart of the storm. Elias was on his feet before the bat-wing doors had stopped swinging. He had seen that look before. It was not fear. It was terror, blind and bottomless. He followed her, pulling on his hat, bending his head against the driving rain. The alley was a river of mud. He saw the stable doors, just opposite, swinging in the wind. She had gone in there. He crossed the alley, the water soaking his jeans to the knee in an instant. He slipped inside the stable. It was dark, the air thick with the smell of wet hay, manure, and the sharp, electric scent of ozone. The horses were restless, stamping and snorting in their stalls. "Sarah?" he called out, his voice low, trying to cut through the din of the storm. He heard a sound, a rhythmic, desperate gasping. From the back, he moved past the stalls, toward the hayloft. She was huddled in the shadows, in an empty stall, her back pressed into the corner, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her hands were clamped over her ears, her whole body shaking so violently he could see it in the occasional flicker of lightning. She was reliving something. He knew it. This storm was just the trigger. He approached her slowly, as he would a spooked foal. He made sure she could see him. He didn't crowd her. He knelt in the straw a few feet away. "It's just the storm, Sarah," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It's just wind and rain. It'll pass." She flinched, a ragged sob tearing from her throat as another boom of thunder shook the barn. "You're safe," he said, moving a little closer. He sat down in the hay, not reaching for her, just sharing the space. "You're in Sable Ridge. You're in the stable. You're safe." He just sat. He let the storm rage, and he let her shake. He was a solid presence in the darkness, a rock for her terror to break against. He sat for 10 minutes, maybe 20, simply bearing witness. The rain began to lessen, the thunder rolling farther away. Her shaking eased, fractionally. She was still gasping, but the rhythm was slower. He edged closer, until his knee was almost touching hers. "May I?" he asked. He didn't wait for an answer, but he moved so slowly she had time to pull away. He put his hand on her shoulder. His hand was warm, heavy, and steady. It was not the hand of a man who hits. It was the hand of a man who holds. The touch broke her. The terror that had frozen her dissolved into a flood of shuddering sobs. She didn't mean to. She didn't want to. But she uncurled, lurching forward, burying her face in the rough, damp wool of his coat. He took her. His arms came around her, pulling her close, holding her tight against his chest. One hand held her back, the other moved to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her damp hair. He held her like she was breakable, and like he would not let her break. He said nothing. He just held her, rocking her gently, absorbing her shudders, until the storm outside and the storm inside her had both quieted to a low, trembling exhaustion. Finally, she was just leaning against him, her breath hitching, the smell of him, wet wool, horses, and something clean, like soap, filling her senses. She pulled back, just enough to look at him. His face was in shadow, but she could feel his eyes on her. He wasn't looking at her with pity, or with the smugness of a man who had tamed her. He was just looking. Overwhelmed, she did the only thing she could. She leaned up, her hand gripping his shirt, and kissed him. It was a kiss of pure desperation. It was a thank you. It was a plea. It was clumsy, and her lips were cold, and it tasted of salt from her tears. It was the first time she had offered a part of herself, willingly, in so very long. And the second it was done, she was horrified. She ripped herself away from him, scrambling back through the straw, her face burning with shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice raw. "I shouldn't have. I can't." She had contaminated him. She had put her filth on the only clean thing she had found. Elias didn't grab for her. He let her go, his own breath unsteady. He watched her get to her feet and stumble out of the stall. He followed her to the barn door, the rain now just a steady drumming on the roof. "Sarah," he called. She froze at the door, her back to him, her shoulders slumped. "It's all right," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She didn't move, couldn't look at him. "I'll be here when you're ready," he said. She bolted, running through the mud and the dimming rain, back to the light of the saloon, leaving him alone in the darkness. The next 3 days were a quiet agony. Clara was hollow-eyed, moving through her chores like a sleepwalker. She would not, could not, look at him. Elias nursed his coffee at his corner table, his patience worn thin, his heart aching with a tenderness that was new to him. He was a man of action, and this waiting was the hardest work he had ever done. On the 4th day, a new man rode into town. He rode a tall gray gelding, and he wore a black bowler hat and a waistcoat. He looked like a preacher, until you saw his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. He had a gun, not low-slung like a cowboy's, but high on his hip, in a town man's holster. He dismounted, tied his horse, and walked directly into the gilded spur. Elias was there, oiling his bridle. The man walked straight to the bar. where Silas Croft was wiping it down. He unrolled a piece of paper. "I'm looking for a woman," the man said. His voice was not loud, but it was crisp and clear, and it cut through the midday quiet. Elias kept his head down, his hands working the oil into the leather, but he was listening with every fiber of his being. "Name of Clara Bellamy." The stranger said, "She's wanted, murder, in Dodge City, killing of a merchant named Bartholomew Griggs. There's a $500 reward for her." Elias watched Silas's face. He saw the flicker of recognition. He saw the memory of the freighter, Jed, and the alley. He saw the small, greedy tightening of Silas's mouth. "Bellamy," Silas said, polishing a glass, trying to sound bored. "Never heard the name." "She's about this tall," the bounty hunter said, ignoring Silas's denial. "Dark hair, blue eyes, frightened looking, but she's dangerous. Stabbed Griggs 3 times. She's been on the run for months." He rolled the paper back up. "I'm Mr. Harlan. I'll be in town for a day or 2. Ask around. That's a lot of money." Harlan turned and walked out, his boots making a decisive, final sound on the floorboards. The saloon was silent. Elias continued to work the oil. He waited. He saw Silas look toward the kitchen, where Clara was scrubbing pots. He saw the saloon owner's eyes narrow, his mind working, the greed warring with the risk. The greed won. Silas disappeared into the kitchen. Elias put down his rag. He got up from his table, not quickly, but with a deliberate, silent purpose. He walked toward the back, as if heading for the outhouse. He stopped just shy of the kitchen doorway. In the shadows of the narrow hall, he could hear their voices. "A lie," Clara was saying, her voice high and thin with panic. "Don't you lie to me, girl," Silas hissed. His voice was a low, vicious thing. "Clara, that's your name, isn't it? That freighter Jed, he knew, and now I know. $500. Please, Mr. Croft, I don't have... It wasn't what they said." "I don't care what it was," Silas snarled. "You're a murderer, and I've got you, but I'm a reasonable man." Elias tensed. He knew what was coming. "That bounty man, he's offering $500, Silas whispered. "I want half, $250. You get it for me. You get it by tomorrow night, or I hand you over to him myself. You understand me?" "I don't have any money. I swear, I only have..." Elias heard the sharp, wet sound of a slap. It echoed in the small hallway. He heard Clara's stifled cry, a sound of pain and utter despair. A cold, hard rage settled over Elias. It was a feeling he knew well. He'd lived with it on the cattle trails. He'd used it in border towns. It made him calm. It made him clear. He knew Silas. The man was a rat. He would take any money Clara had, and then he would sell her to Harlan for the full $500. He turned, his boots making no sound on the floor. He walked out the back door, into the harsh sunlight. He did not go to the outhouse. He went to the livery. He had to prepare. The time for waiting was over. The slap from Silas sent her reeling, but it was his words that crippled her. $250. By tomorrow night. She fled the kitchen, a hand clapped to her stinging cheek, the sound of his low, greasy laughter following her. She ran to her room, the tiny closet at the end of the hall, and locked the door. She stood in the dark, her back to the wood, panting. $250. She had 7. She had $7.38, saved from the pittance Silas paid her, hidden under a loose floorboard. It was not enough to buy her life. It was not even enough to buy her passage out of this town. She was trapped. Silas knew. He would take her $7, and then he would hand her to Mr. Harlan. The thought of it, the cold, final click of the bounty hunter's cuffs, made her stomach clench. She sank onto the cot. She would not wait for tomorrow night. She had to run now. She pulled her carpet bag from under the bed, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the clasp. A change of dress. Her mother's tarnished silver brush. The knife. She had nothing else. She would run into the desert. She would take her chances with the coyotes and the heat. It was better than a rope. She waited, listening to the raucous noise of the saloon filter through the thin walls. The piano, the shouting, the clink of glasses. She waited for 2 hours, until the moon was high and the noise had settled into a dull, drunken roar. She eased her door open. The hallway was empty, lit by a single, smoky lamp at the far end. She slipped down the back stairs, her bare feet making no sound on the wood. The back door, the alley, that was her only way out. She pushed the door open a crack. The alley was dark, save for the yellow rectangle of light cast from the kitchen window. She took a deep breath, clutching her bag, and slipped out into the cool night air. "A bit late for an errand. Miss Bellamy." The voice was calm, crisp, and it came from the shadows by the rain barrel. Clara froze, a scream dying in her throat. "Mr." Harlan stepped into the light. He wore his bowler hat, his waistcoat buttoned. He looked like a clerk, not a hunter. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice conversational. "Ever since I spoke to Mr. Croft. He has a very poor poker face. So do you." Clara's mind went blank with terror. She dropped her bag and bolted. She didn't make it 2 steps. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a steel trap, and spun her around, slamming her back against the rough wood of the saloon wall. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. "None of that," he chided, his face close. His eyes were pale and empty. "I'm a professional. I don't get paid more if you're bruised, but I will get paid." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a pair of iron handcuffs. "Please," she gasped, the word tearing from her raw throat. "Please, you don't understand. It wasn't... I didn't..." "You can tell that to the judge in Dodge City," Harlan said, unlocking one of the cuffs. "Now, give me your right hand." "No," she cried, and began to fight, twisting, kicking, trying to bring her knee up. He grunted, annoyed, and shoved her harder against the wall, clamping his free hand over her mouth. "I said, be still!" "Take your hands off her." The voice came from the alley's entrance, low and flat. Both Clara and Harlan froze. Elias Trent stood silhouetted against the pale moonlight of the main street. He was in his shirt sleeves, his hat on. His gun belt was not on his hips. His hands were empty, loose at his sides. Harlan did not release Clara, but he turned his head. "This is official business. Friend, I have a warrant for this woman." "I don't care what you have," Elias said, taking one slow step into the alley. He moved with a deliberate, unsettling calm. "Let her go." Harlan laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You're interfering with a federal warrant. That's a hanging offense in some territories. Walk away, cowboy. This isn't your concern." "She is my concern," Elias said. He took another step, the faint light catching the hard planes of his face. "And you have the wrong woman." Harlan narrowed his eyes. "This is Clara Bellamy, wanted for the murder of Bartholomew Griggs." "This woman," Elias said, his voice like iron, "is Rose Miller. She's my fiancée." Clara stopped breathing. The world tilted. She stared at him, her mind unable to grasp the words. Fiancé. The lie was so enormous, so impossible. It hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Harlan was taken aback. He loosened his grip on Clara's arm, just slightly, to get a better look at Elias. "Fiancé?" he repeated, skepticism dripping from the word. "She works in this dung heap, cleans spittoons, goes by the name Sarah Smith." "She's earning money for our passage to Oregon," Elias said, his voice never wavering. He was close now, only 10 feet away. "Silas calls her Sarah because he's a lazy drunk who can't be bothered to learn a name. Her name is Rose." He looked past Harlan, his gaze finding Clara's. His eyes were steady. "Isn't that right?" Rose? She was stunned into silence. He was offering her a lifeline, a name, a story. She could only nod, a tiny, jerky movement. Harlan looked from Elias's hard, certain face to Clara's terrified one. He saw the fading yellow bruise on her temple, the fresh red mark on her cheek from Silas's hand. He saw the way she looked at the cowboy, like he was the only solid thing on earth. He weighed the $500 reward against the man standing in front of him. Elias had no gun, but he looked like he didn't need one. He looked like a man who was dug in, who had made a decision and would not be moved. A man who might die, or kill, over this. The bounty hunter was a businessman. This was a poor profit margin. "She fits the description," Harlan said, but the certainty was gone from his voice. "A lot of women fit the description," Elias countered. "Frightened. Dark hair. This territory is full of them. You're mistaken." Harlan held the stare for a long 10 seconds. Finally, he let out a long breath and slowly, deliberately, took his hands off Clara. He put the cuffs back in his pocket. "A man makes a mistake," he said softly. "But I'll be checking. I'll send a wire to Dodge, get a better description, maybe a photograph. If I find out you're lying to me, Cowboy, it's obstruction, and I will be back. For her, and for you." "We'll be gone by then," Elias said, "to Oregon." Harlan tipped his bowler hat, a gesture of pure mockery. "Good luck to you, Rose." He turned, his boots clicking on the hard-packed earth, and walked out of the alley. The moment he was gone, Clara's legs gave out. She slid down the wall, her hands scraping on the rough planks, and landed in a heap in the dirt. Her bag lay beside her. She began to shake, deep, racking tremors that shook her from the inside out. Elias was at her side in an instant. He knelt, picking up her bag. "Can you stand?" She couldn't answer. She could only shake her head, gasping. "All right." His voice was rough. He didn't coddle her. He hooked one arm under her knees, the other around her back, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her and her bag, not to her small room, but down the hall to his room 4. He kicked the door open, carried her inside, and set her down on the edge of his bed. The room was larger than hers, with a real window and a chair. He lit the lamp, and the small room was filled with a warm, yellow glow. Then he did something that terrified her. He put the key in the lock and turned it. She flinched, scrambling back on the bed. "What are you doing?" "I'm keeping you safe," he said, pocketing the key. "Silas will know Harlan left empty-handed. He'll come looking for you. He won't look in here." "He'll know you lied," she whispered, her voice raw. They'll... "They won't," Elias said. "I'm going to sit in this chair, by this door. Nobody is coming in." He sat, he put her bag on the floor, crossed his arms, and tilted his hat down, and he waited. They sat in silence for hours. The noise from the saloon ebbed and flowed, finally dying away after 2 in the morning. Clara sat on the bed, her back against the headboard, her knees drawn up. She watched him. He did not sleep. He just sat, a solid, unmoving guardian. When the first gray light of dawn touched the window, he finally stood. Stretching his stiff muscles, he unlocked the door. "Stay here," he said, and left. She was alone for half an hour. She heard him moving around outside, his boots on the boardwalk. He returned with a tin mug of steaming black coffee and a piece of bread. He'd gotten them from the kitchen before the cook was fully awake. He handed them to her. Her hands were shaking too badly to take the cup. He set it, and the bread, on the small table beside the bed. "Eat," he said. She stared at the food. Then she looked at him. Her voice was a dry croak. "Why?" He turned from the window. "You need to eat." "No." She shook her head. "Why did you do that? Why did you lie for me?" He was silent for a moment, his gray eyes searching her face. I heard Silas hit you. I heard him threaten you. I knew he'd sell you, one way or another. But you lied. You called me your fiancé. You tied yourself to me. That man, Harlan, he'll be back. He'll find out. He'll come for you, too." Her voice cracked. "You don't even know me. You don't know what I did. You've ruined yourself for nothing." He walked over to the bed, not to sit, just to stand and look down at her. His face was hard in the morning light, etched with lines of sun and sleeplessness. "I know you were shaking in the barn," he said, his voice low. "I know you were running, with $7 and a change of dress. I know what Silas is, and I know what that bounty hunter is." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I've been drifting for 10 years, seen a lot of things. I've killed men who deserved it, men who had it coming. If you did, too, I'll still stand beside you." His words hit her with the force of a physical blow. No one. He was not judging her. He was not disgusted. He was waiting. He was accepting the worst of her, and he was still standing there. The dam broke, the wall she had built around herself, the one that had survived beatings and humiliation and fear. It crumbled into dust. A single sob, a dry, tearing sound, escaped her, and then it all came out. The words tumbled from her, choked and fragmented, a torrent of poison she had held inside for so long. "His name was Bartholomew Griggs," she whispered, the words burning her throat. "He was a merchant in Dodge. My father was a gambler. He sold me. He owed Griggs money, and he gave him me as collateral." Elias sat on the edge of the bed, not touching her, just listening, his face a mask of stone. "He kept me," she wept, the tears now flowing hot and fast. "He kept me in his house. He called me his ward. He gave me dresses, jewelry, and he locked the door. Every night, She couldn't say it. She choked, her hands twisting in the blanket. He was not a kind man. He liked when I was afraid." She told him everything, the humiliation, the years of it, the silence, the way the townspeople looked at her, the other women, how they whispered, the way he would smile, that cold, wet smile, when he knew he had broken her again. "I tried to leave," she said, her voice dropping to a dull monotone. "I'd saved money, $1 here, 50 cents. I'd saved for a year. I was going to just disappear. He found my bag. He wasn't even angry. He laughed. He said he liked the fight. He said he'd break my legs, so I'd never try to run again. He came at me, and—" She stopped. She was shaking again. "I had a knife, a paring knife, from the kitchen. I'd been packing some food. It was in my apron. I just held it out. I just wanted him to stop. He walked right onto it. He just walked onto it." She looked at her own hands, as if they were the knife. He looked surprised. He looked down, and then, all the blood. I ran. I just ran. I took his horse and I ran. His brother found him. He said I stabbed him 3 times. He said I stole his money. But I didn't. I just ran." She looked up at Elias, her eyes hollow pits of despair. His brother wanted the business. He wanted the house, a dead harlot who murdered his poor, kind brother. It was a simple story. It was an easy way to get everything. And I was just Clara. She finished, empty, gasping, waiting for the disgust, for him to pull away, to call Harlan back himself. Elias was silent for a long time. He absorbed the whole ugly story. He did not flinch. He did not move. When she was finally quiet, save for the sound of her own ragged breathing, he moved. He didn't say, "It's all right." He didn't say, "He deserved it." He said, his voice rough, "You're here now." He leaned forward, and he did not touch her body. He just reached out and took her hand. Her hand was cold, damp and shaking. His was large, warm, calloused, and perfectly steady. He held it. "You're not alone anymore," he said. She stared at their joined hands. This man, this quiet, steady man. He knew the worst, the most vile, unspeakable truth of her, and he was still holding her hand. The tension in the room was a living thing. It was not the terror of the alley. It was not the coldness of her past. It was something new, something aching and hot. It was the connection of two people who knew what it was to be hunted. He leaned closer. He smelled of coffee in the clean, cold morning air. He lifted his other hand and, with a rough thumb, wiped a tear from her cheek. She flinched, but did not pull away. He kept his hand on her face, his gaze holding hers. He leaned in, slowly, giving her time to retreat, and kissed her forehead. It was a promise, a benediction. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, a shudder passing through her. This time, when she moved, it was not desperation, like in the stable. It was a question. She lifted her face, her hand tightening in his, and kissed him. It was raw. It was tender. It was the kiss of two survivors. He answered her, his mouth gentle, then firm. He shifted, his arms coming around her, pulling her from her fortress of blankets, against his solid, warm chest. He laid her down on the bed, and for the first time in her life, she was not afraid. They made love in the gray morning light, with the sounds of the town waking up outside. It was not a grand passion. It was something more elemental. It was a reclaiming. It was two broken people finding a momentary, perfect safety in each other's arms. He was achingly tender, his hands mapping her body, learning her, as if committing her to memory. He held her, kissed her scars, and when he was inside her, he held her face between his hands and just looked at her, until she truly, finally, saw him. She clung to him, not as a savior, but as an anchor in a storm, and for a few stolen hours. There was no bounty hunter, there was no past. There was only this room, this bed, and this man. When she woke, the sun was high. He was dressed, sitting in the chair by the window, watching her. He had let her sleep. The reality of the morning, of Harlan, of Silas, flooded back. She was in his bed, naked, a murderer. She had dragged this good, quiet man into her filth. She pulled the sheet up, her face crumpling. The tears came again, hot and silent. "You don't know my past," she whispered, the words thick with shame. "You say you do, but you don't. You can't. It's a stain. It's on me. And now it's on you." He stood up, not with anger, but with a weary sort of patience. He walked to the bed and knelt beside it, so his face was level with hers. "I know enough," he said, his voice firm. "Your past is dead. Bartholomew Griggs is dead, the woman he owned. She's dead, too." He took her hand, the one that was clutching the sheet. "Then tell me your future." She stared at him, tears blurring his face. "My future," she choked out. "My future is a rope. Elias, you know it." "No," he said, his voice fierce, cutting. "Your future is 2 days' ride from here. Up in the high country, my land. It's not much. A broken-down cabin. A creek that runs cold, but it's hidden. It's safe." He squeezed her hand. "We can disappear. Clara, a new name, a real one. We'll tell them you're Rose Trent, or Mary, or whatever name you choose. We can start over." She wanted it. She wanted it with a force that hurt, a deep, physical ache. To be Rose Trent, to be safe, to be with him. But she looked at his honest, sun-worn face. She saw what he was offering. His name, his protection, his life. "And be a burden," she whispered, the old shame rising like bile. "Have you looking over your shoulder for the rest of your days, waiting for Harlan, waiting for the law to ride in? I can't." She pulled her hand from his. I won't do that to you. I won't be the thing that destroys you." He looked at her, a long, searching look. She expected him to argue, to plead, to try and convince her. He did none of those things. He just nodded, as if he'd expected her refusal. "Get some rest," he said, his voice quiet again. "Don't leave this room. I mean it." He stood, unlocked the door, and left, closing it firmly behind him. The sound of the key turning in the lock again was a final, lonely sound. She was alone, confused, and heartbroken. She had done the right thing. She had saved him from herself. She lay in the bed for an hour, then dragged herself up, wrapping the sheet around her. She went to the window. The street was busy. She watched, her heart a cold knot. Then she saw him. He was not at the livery, saddling his horse to flee. He was not at the land office, selling his deed. He was at the general store. He came out with a heavy sack of flour over one shoulder. He walked it to the livery and went back. He returned with a side of bacon, a large sack of beans, and 2 boxes of rifle cartridges. He went back a third time and came out with rope and a new axe handle. He was not running. He was not abandoning her. He was gathering supplies. He was preparing to leave town, and he was methodically, quietly, preparing for a long stay. He was preparing to take her with him, whether she thought she was a burden or not. His steady, stubborn actions were a louder, more powerful answer than any words of persuasion. He had made his decision. The new man rode into Sable Ridge not on a bounty hunter's wind, but on the back of a tired-looking government horse. He wore a dusty but regulation coat, and the badge pinned to it was dull tin, not polished silver. He was a deputy. He had a lean face, sharp, quiet eyes, and a way of looking at the town as if it were a page of evidence. Elias saw him from the window of room 4, where he had just finished barricading the door from the inside with the chair. Clara was asleep, a fitful, exhausted sleep, her face pale in the afternoon light. He had been gone for nearly an hour, gathering the last of the supplies, strapping them to the pack mule he'd bought and tied out back of the livery. He had planned to wait for moonrise. This new arrival changed everything. The deputy, his name was Amos Reed, according to the man at the livery, did not go to the hotel. He went straight to the Gilded Spur. Elias felt the cold hand of inevitability. He slipped out of the room, locking it from the outside, and went down the hall. He didn't go down the stairs. He went to the small storage closet at the end, the one that shared a thin wall with Silas Croft's back office. He pressed his ear to the wood. He could hear the murmur of voices. "Not him," Silas was saying, his voice oily with false cooperation. "Harlan was a bounty man. He left this one, this Sarah. She's the one you want." "The warrant is for Clara Bellamy," the deputy's voice replied, flat and devoid of emotion. "Is that her name?" "It is," Silas said, the lie coming fast and smooth. She confessed the whole thing to me, crying. Said she stabbed Mr. Griggs in Dodge, said she didn't mean to. But she did it. I told her. I said, 'Child, you got to turn yourself in.' But she's terrified, hiding in her room right now. I'd wager." Elias's blood ran cold. It was one thing to be hunted for a crime. It was another to be hunted with a false confession paving the way. Silas had just sealed her fate, turning the law's suspicion into cold, hard certainty. He didn't wait to hear more. He moved, his boots silent on the floorboards. He was back at room 4 in seconds. He unlocked the door, pushed it open, and kicked the chair away. Clara shot up from the bed, her eyes wide with terror. "What is it?" "Get your shoes on," he said, his voice low and urgent. He was already checking his revolver, sliding 6 heavy cartridges into the cylinder. "The law is here. A deputy from Dodge. Silas just told him you confessed." "Confessed?" she whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. "But I never—" "It doesn't matter." He's coming for you. We're not waiting for moonlight." He grabbed her bag, shoved the bread he'd saved into it, and threw her the jacket he'd been wearing. "Put this on. It'll be cold." He went to the window, pushing it open. It looked out over the saloon's low kitchen roof. "We go this way. The hall is a trap." "Elias, There's no time. Clara, we go or you hang. Now! Come!" She didn't hesitate. She trusted the urgency in his voice. He climbed out first, landing softly on the pitched shingles. He reached back, grabbed her waist, and lifted her out, setting her beside him. They scrambled across the roof, the sound of their boots muffled by the distant piano, and dropped 6 feet into the alley. The pack mule and his buckskin were tied 50 yards away, behind the livery. The mare he'd bought for her was with them. He grabbed her hand. "Don't run. Walk fast. Act like you're supposed to be here." They crossed the alley, rounded the corner of the blacksmith shop, and entered the livery from the rear. The stable was dim and quiet. Their horses nickered softly. "Get on the mare," he said, handing her the reins. "Stay on her." As he untied the mule's lead, the front door of the livery creaked open. Deputy Reed stood there, silhouetted against the bright street. Silas Croft was peering around his shoulder, his face a mask of greedy panic. "There! That's them!" Silas shrieked. "Hold it, Trent!" Reed commanded, his hand dropping to his holster. "Stop right there!" Elias didn't stop. He slapped the rump of the pack mule, sending it trotting out the back opening. He grabbed the mare's bridle, pulling Clara with him. "Hold tight!" He vaulted onto his buckskin. The deputy was running through the stable now, shouting for them to halt. Elias pulled the mare's lead, and the 2 horses burst from the livery at a gallop, not onto the main street, but into the network of back alleys and washes that defined the edge of Sable Ridge. A shot rang out. It wasn't aimed to hit, it was a warning, but it was lost in the thunder of their hooves. They rode hard, splashing through a shallow, filthy creek, past the tanner's yard, and into the open desert. They did not look back. They rode into the teeth of the setting sun, toward the dark, jagged line of the mountains that rose from the prairie floor. They were shadows fleeing the light, and Elias knew Reed would not be far behind. They rode under the moon, a cold, silver disk that offered no warmth, only light to be tracked by. Elias pushed them hard, his knowledge of the land their only shield. He avoided the open flats, keeping to the dry ravines, the arroyos cut by forgotten floods. The horses' hooves on the rock was the only sound, a sharp, clattering rhythm in the vast, cold silence. They rode for hours. Clara clung to the saddle horn, her body unused to such punishment, screaming in protest. Her hands were raw, her legs were chafed, but she did not complain. She just rode, her eyes fixed on the steady, broad line of Elias's back. He was her North Star, her only point of compass in a world that had come undone. He knew of a place, an old trapper's cabin, hidden deep in the high country. 2 days' ride, he'd told her, back in the room. If we can make it, it's high, it's hidden. He'll never find us there. But the journey was grueling. They rested only when the horses were failing. Their first stop was just before dawn, in a narrow canyon where the wind whined over the rocks. Elias gave her water and a piece of hardtack. He stood watch, his rifle across his lap, his face turned toward the land they had crossed. He did not sleep. She watched him, her heart a heavy, aching thing. This man, he had a home, a piece of land, a future, and he had just thrown it all away for her, for a woman he barely knew, a woman with a noose hanging over her head. They rode again as the sun set, climbing now, the air growing thin and sharp. The terrain shifted from gravel and sand to sheer rock and pine. Clara's mare stumbled, and Clara, her strength gone, fell. She was on the ground before Elias could even dismount. He was at her side in an instant. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled. "I'm all right," she lied, her teeth chattering. "I'm just tired." He put his hand on her forehead. She was burning. The fall, the cold, the terror, and the bone-deep exhaustion had conspired against her. Her body had given up. "You have a fever," he said, his voice flat with a new kind of worry. "No, I'm fine. We have to keep going." She tried to push him away, to get to her horse, but her limbs were water. "We stop," he said. It was not a suggestion. He found a shallow cave, barely an overhang, shielded from the wind by a stand of juniper. He half carried her into it, settling her on his own bedroll. He gathered wood and, with practiced skill, built a small, smokeless fire, its heat bouncing off the low rock ceiling. She began to shake, the fever taking full hold. She was no longer in the mountains. She was back in Dodge, in the dark room, with Griggs's face looming over her, his breath hot and sour. She cried out, a small, broken sound. Elias was there, his hand on her shoulder. "Clara, you're safe. It's just me. It's Elias." He spent the night tending to her. He forced sips of water between her cracked lips. He bathed her face and her wrists with a cloth soaked in the cold water from his canteen. His gentleness was a thing she could not understand. He was a hard man, a man who had killed, a man who was now a fugitive himself. Yet his touch, as he brushed the damp hair from her face, was as tender as any she had ever imagined. In the deepest part of the night, when the fever was at its height, the last of her defenses broke. She was delirious, her words tumbling out, thick and slurred. "He's right," she whispered, her eyes wide and unseeing, staring at the cave roof. "Who's right?" Elias asked softly, wiping her brow. "The deputy?" "No, Griggs. He always told me." The tears came, hot and stinging, sliding down her temples into her hair. "He said I was nothing. He said I was ruined, that no good man would ever—" She choked on a sob. "He said no one would ever want me, not to keep, just to use." She turned her head, her fevered gaze finding his. That's the part that's true, not the killing. I did that, but the shame is him, believing him." Her voice broke. "I believed him, Elias, even with you. I was waiting for you to see the truth, that I'm worthless. I'm a stain. I'm not a woman you build a life with. I'm a woman you run from, or bury." This was her deepest, darkest secret. Not the blood on her hands, but the poison in her soul, the belief that she was unlovable. Elias's face was carved from stone in the firelight. He listened, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving hers. When she was finished, spent, her confession hanging in the small, warm cave, he did not speak for a long time. He just acted. He leaned down, and with a tenderness that shattered her, he kissed her forehead. He kissed her tear-stained cheeks. He kissed her chapped, trembling lips. "He lied," Elias said, his voice a low, rough growl. "He lied every time he breathed. He was the lie, not you." He eased onto the bedroll beside her, pulling her against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, sharing his warmth, his solid, living strength. "You're not a stain, Clara. You are not what he said." He held her. He held her through the shaking. He held her as the fever raged, and finally, in the cold hours before dawn, as it broke, she woke to the smell of pine smoke. She was weak, but her mind was clear. She was wrapped in his jacket, her head on his saddle. He was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in the pack mule's harness. He had stayed. He had heard the ugliest, weakest part of her, and he had not left. The tenderness he had shown her, his steadfast refusal to see her as she saw herself, was overwhelming. It was more powerful than the fever, more powerful than her fear. She felt new, scoured clean. She sat up. He turned, his eyes immediately assessing. "How do you feel?" "Weak," she said, her voice a croak. "But clear." He nodded, relieved. He brought her the canteen. As she drank, she looked at him. This was a man who saw her, all of her. That night, they slept side by side. But it was not just for warmth. The intimacy they shared was not the raw, desperate finding of that first morning in the saloon. This was different. It was deeper. It was a conscious choice, a sealing of the truth he had spoken. When he touched her, she did not flinch. When he kissed her, she did not pull away. She let go. For the first time in her life, she gave up the brittle, terrible control she had clung to. She let him see her, all of her. She let him hold her, all of her. And in the safety of his arms, in that small cave high in the mountains, Clara Bellamy finally, truly, let herself be loved. They reached the cabin late the next afternoon. It was hidden, just as he'd said, in a grove of yellow-leafed aspens, tucked against the side of a granite cliff. A small, clear creek ran 20 yards from the front door. It was old, built of rough-hewn logs, the roof thick with moss. It was worn, battered by wind and snow, but the chimney was stone, and the door was solid. It was safe. For a week, the world was just that cabin, that creek, and the ring of the axe. They had peace. It was a strange, foreign feeling, and Clara drank it in like water. She healed. The color returned to her cheeks. The hollows under her eyes faded. They worked. Elias rechinked the logs, fixed the broken latch on the door, and spent 2 days patching the roof. Clara scrubbed the inside of the cabin, swept the packed earth floor, and cooked their meals of beans and bacon over the small hearth. She fed the mule. She mended their clothes. These small, daily chores were a balm, a way of building a life, one tiny, solid piece at a time. One afternoon, Elias was trying to teach her how to tie a diamond hitch on the pack mule. The mule, stubborn, kept nudging him, trying to eat the rope. "You worthless piece of hide," Elias grumbled at the animal, shoving its head away. "You've got one job, and you can't even stand still." The mule brayed, a loud, obnoxious sound, and swung its head back, knocking Elias's hat clean off his head. He stood there, hatless, glaring at the animal with pure, offended dignity. And Clara laughed. It was not a giggle or a small, polite sound. It was a real, deep, rusty laugh, a sound of pure, unbridled amusement. It startled her as much as it did him. She clapped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide. Elias just stared at her, his stern expression melting. A slow smile spread across his face. He picked up his hat, dusted it on his knee, and looked at her. "It's a good sound," he said, his voice soft. "I'd like to hear it again." That night, sitting by the fire, they spoke of the future. They spoke of Oregon, of a valley he knew where the land was rich. "Rose," he said, looking into the flames. "I meant what I said. Rose Trent. It's a good name." "Rose," she whispered, testing the shape of it on her tongue. "Rose Trent." She looked at him, a small, shy smile touching her lips. I think she could be very happy." They allowed themselves to hope. The cabin became their world. The law, Dodge City, Silas Croft. It all seemed a lifetime away, a bad dream from another world. The next morning, Clara took the wooden bucket to go down to the creek for water. The air was crisp, the sun bright on the granite peaks. She was humming, a tune she didn't even realize she knew. Elias was behind the cabin, splitting the last of a deadfall pine. The rhythmic thwack of his axe was a comforting, steady sound. She reached the creek, knelt by the rushing water, and dipped the bucket in. The cold was a sharp, clean shock. And then the sound of the axe stopped. She froze. The silence that fell was sudden, heavy and wrong. "Clara," Elias called. His voice was not loud, but it was tight. Stay at the creek." She stood up, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She saw a man, a stranger, standing in the clearing, not 20 feet from Elias. He wore a deputy's coat, and he had a rifle. Not a pistol, a long-range rifle, held loosely, but ready. It was Deputy Reed. He had tracked them. Through the ravines, over the mountains, he had found them. Elias stood by the woodpile, the axe in his hand. He was not moving toward his own gun, which was on his belt, holstered. He knew he was too late. "You've led me a hell of a chase, Trent," the deputy said. His voice was not angry. It was tired. "I'll give you that." "She's not here," Elias said, his body angled, blocking the view of the cabin door. "Don't lie to me," Reed said, his eyes scanning the clearing. He saw the bucket, dropped by the creek. He saw her. "I'm not a bounty man. I'm the law. I've tracked you for 5 days. I know she's here." "She's my wife," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "Rose Trent, the woman you're looking for. She's dead." "That's a fine story," Reed said. He shifted the rifle, the barrel now aimed at Elias's chest. "I have a warrant, executable in any territory. Step aside. I'm taking her in." Elias dropped the axe. He raised his hands, slowly, to shoulder height, but he did not move. He was a wall. He was blocking the door to the life they had just started to build. "No." The deputy's eyes went cold. He was not a man who enjoyed this, but he was a man of duty. "I am authorized to use any force necessary to execute this warrant. Mr. Trent," he said, his voice flat. "Obstruction is a federal crime. Resisting, that's suicide. I will shoot you. I will put a bullet right through your chest. And then I will walk into that cabin, and I will take her. Don't make me do it. For the last time, step aside." She did not hear a gunshot. She heard a dull, wet thud, like an axe striking damp wood, followed by a heavy grunt. The sound of the axe handle falling, clattering on the rocks, was the sound that made her run. Clara scrambled up the creek bank, the empty bucket abandoned, her heart hammering against her ribs. She burst into the clearing just as Deputy Reed was hauling a groaning Elias to his feet. Elias's face was a mask of blood, a deep, blossoming cut over his right eye. His hands were bound behind his back. The rifle lay on the ground, its stock dark. Reed had not shot him. He had used the gun as a club. "Elias!" she screamed, stumbling toward him. "Stay back, woman," Reed snapped, his chest heaving. He yanked Elias upright, shoving him against a pine tree. He looked at Clara, his eyes cold and assessing. He had not expected this fight. Elias had not come quietly. "So," Reed said, wiping a smear of Elias's blood from his own cheek, "you're Clara Bellamy." She stopped, 10 feet from him, her gaze locked on Elias. He was conscious, his one good eye finding hers, blazing with a fury she had never seen. "You," Clara said, her voice shaking. "You hit him." "He resisted," Reed said flatly. "He drew on me. I disarmed him. He's lucky to be alive. He's under arrest for obstruction." He turned his attention back to Elias, pulling a second set of restraints from his belt. "I'll tie him to this tree. He'll be here a day or two before he's found. Maybe the wolves will be merciful." "No," Clara cried. You can't just leave him." The deputy looked at her, and a cruel, cold logic dawned in his eyes. He had what he wanted. He had his prisoner. He just needed to get her back to Dodge. "You're right," he said, as if considering it. "I'm a lawman, not an executioner." He holstered his pistol and gestured to the bound and bleeding Elias. "So we have a deal to make. Miss Bellamy." He laid out the terms, his voice as flat as the prairie. "You come with me, now. No tricks, no running. You ride quiet, and you go in the cell. If you do that, He lives. I'll tie him, but I'll leave him with a knife he can reach in an hour. He'll be fine." He paused, letting the offer settle. "But if you run," he continued, his voice dropping, "if you try to hide, if you give me one moment of trouble between here and Dodge, I will put a bullet in his head, right here, right in front of you. Then I will hunt you down. Your choice, his life for your cooperation." It was a perfect, brutal trap. Clara looked at Elias. His face was bloody. He was beaten. He had been willing to die for her, right here, by the woodpile. She looked at the cabin, their cabin, the roof half mended. She looked at the smoke, still rising from the chimney. The 7 days of peace she had been given were over. Elias saw the look on her face. He knew what she was going to do. "Clara, no!" he shouted, straining against the ropes. "Don't you do it! Run! I'll be fine! Run!" She turned her back to him. She could not look at him. If she looked at him, her resolve would break. She faced the deputy, her small frame rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. The numbness she had felt in Sable Ridge, the cold, hollow feeling of inevitability, settled over her again. She was no longer Rose Trent. She was Clara Bellamy, a piece of property to be claimed. "I'll go," she said. Her voice was dead. "Clara, damn it! Don't you do this!" Elias roared. He threw himself against the tree, the ropes cutting into his wrists. "Don't give him what he wants!" "A wise choice," Reed said. He nodded, satisfied. He walked to her, took her arm in a hard grip, and led her to the mare. He tied her hands, not together, but to the horn of her saddle. It was a lead, a leash. "You gave me peace," Clara whispered, not to Reed, not to herself, but to the man she was leaving. "That's more than I ever had." She did not look back. She could not. Reed mounted his own horse, took the reins of her mare, and kicked his animal into a walk. Clara rode out of the clearing, her back straight, her face a pale, frozen mask. The last thing she heard was Elias shouting her name, his voice raw with rage and despair, until the sound was finally lost in the wind sighing through the pines. The journey down from the mountains was a blur of misery. Deputy Reed was not conversational. He was a machine, focused on the trail. He pushed them hard, stopping only to water the horses, eating jerky from his saddlebag as they rode. Clara's numbness held for the first day. It was a shield, protecting her from the image of Elias, bloody and bound, from the cold that was sinking into her bones. But on the second day, as the pine-covered mountains gave way to the rolling, desolate plains, the numbness began to crack. A new feeling, hot and sharp, was replacing it. It was rage. It was the fury of the hunted animal that has finally been cornered. She had let Griggs define her. She had let Silas threaten her. She had let Harlan and Reed hunt her. And now, she had let her capture be the price of Elias's life. She thought of him, his kindness, his patience, the way he had held her through the fever, the way his eyes had looked when he said, "Tell me your future." She had no future, not one that ended in a cell. On the third day, they reached the Cimarron River. It was high from the mountain melt, a wide, churning ribbon of muddy brown water. It was dangerous. Reed paused on the bank, judging the current. "We cross here," he said. "It's shallower than it looks." He urged his horse into the water, pulling Clara's mare behind him. The current was stronger than he thought. The horses struggled, their feet slipping on the rocky, uneven bottom. They were halfway across, in the deepest part of the channel. When the water was swirling around Clara's knees, Reed's horse stumbled, and he cursed, pulling its head up. He was focused on his animal. He was not focused on her. It was not a plan. It was an instinct, a raw, violent impulse for survival. Clara yanked her mare's head to the side, hard, with her hand still tied to the horn. The motion was violent. Throwing the horse off balance, the mare screamed, colliding with Reed's mount. "What in?" Reed shouted, turning, his hand flying to his pistol. Clara didn't wait. She threw herself from the saddle, a dead weight, using her tied hands as an anchor. Her entire body slammed into Reed, knocking him clean off his horse. They went under together, plunged into the freezing, silt-heavy water. The shock of the cold was like 1,000 knives. Clara was a fury. She clawed at him, her hands useless. So she used her legs, her teeth. She kicked, tangled her legs with his, driving him deeper. He was heavy, his coat and gun belt pulling him down. He bellowed, a sound of bubbles and rage, and struck her, a hard, glancing blow to her temple. The world went white and silver. The roar of the water filled her ears. She was free. The tie to the saddle horn had snapped, or she had been ripped from it. But she was drowning. Her lungs were on fire. The current had her, tumbling her like a piece of driftwood. She fought. She did not know which way was up. She just swam, her arms weak, her dress a shroud. Her hand hit something, a branch. She grabbed it, a half-submerged cottonwood, and clung to it, her head breaking the surface. She gasped, coughing up water, her body shaking with a violence that was not her own. Downstream, she saw Reed. He had managed to grab his horse's tail. He was screaming at her, his face purple with rage, as the animal dragged him toward the far bank. He had lost his rifle in the river. Clara did not wait. She hauled herself out of the water, crawling on her hands and knees, dragging herself onto the muddy bank. She was soaked, freezing, and her head was spinning, but she was free. She got to her feet and ran, stumbling into the thick sagebrush that lined the riverbank, disappearing into the gray, unforgiving landscape. Elias had worked the skinning knife from his boot within 5 minutes of them disappearing. Reed had been arrogant. He had tied Elias's hands, but he had not searched his boots. It took him another 20 minutes, his hands numb and bloody behind his back, to saw through the thick rope. He was on his buckskin in less than a minute. He did not take the pack mule. He took his rifle, his bedroll, and a canteen. He was not a man built for patience. He was a tracker, and he was hunting. He followed their trail, his face a grim, bloody mask. He rode for 2 days, barely stopping, his eyes on the ground, reading the story of their passage. He was a day behind them. He found the river crossing at dawn on the 3rd day. He saw the tracks. He saw where the horses had entered, and where one, Reed's, had scrambled out on the far bank. He saw the tracks of the mare, farther downstream, on this side, and he saw the small, stumbling footprints leading away from the water. She was on foot. She was soaked, and the temperature had dropped below freezing last night. He pushed his horse, his heart a cold knot of fear. He was no longer tracking a deputy. He was tracking a ghost. He found where she had fallen. He found where she had rested. She was staggering, moving west, away from Dodge, away from everything. He found her just after noon. She had curled into a hollow at the base of a large, gnarled juniper tree, seeking a shelter from the wind that was no shelter at all. She was blue. Her dress was stiff with frozen mud. She was half-conscious, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed. "Clara!" He was off his horse, kneeling beside her, his voice rough. She did not respond. He felt for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready beat, like a trapped bird's wing. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency. He stripped her wet, frozen clothes from her body, his hands impersonal. He chafed her frozen limbs. He wrapped her, naked, in his dry bedroll, and then wrapped his own jacket around that. He forced 2 sips of brandy from his flask between her blue lips. He built a fire, not a small one, but a blazing roar of juniper and sage, and laid her so close the wool of the blanket steamed. He held her, rubbing her back, her arms, forcing his own life and warmth into her. It was hours before she spoke. Her first word was a whisper. "Cold." "I know," he said, his voice thick. "I've got you. You're safe." She finally opened her eyes. She saw his face, the dried blood, the deep worry in his eyes. You came. I told you, he said, I'd stand beside you. That night, they camped. They were fugitives again. But something had changed. The river had washed away the last of Clara's submission. She sat by the fire, wrapped in his blanket, her dress drying on a branch. She was gaunt, bruised, but her eyes were clear. He'll come again, Elias said, cleaning his rifle. Read, or he'll send others. They know. They'll never stop coming. We can go north, to the territories, but we'll always be looking over our shoulder. Clara watched the flames. She thought of the river, the cold, the fight. She thought of the cabin, and the feeling of the axe handle in her own hands, splitting wood. No, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a woman who had made a decision. I'm not running anymore. Elias stopped cleaning. He looked at her. I won't let them hunt us. She looked at him, her gaze as steady as his. I won't be the ghost that haunts your life. I'm tired of being afraid. She took a deep breath. We ride to Dodge. Elias stared at her. Clara, that's a hanging court. Grigg's brother owns half the town. You'll never get a fair trial. I don't care, she said. I'm not running. I killed him. Elias, I will stand in that courtroom and I will tell them. I will tell them all. Not just that I killed him, but why. I'm done being Clara the harlot. I'm done being Clara the murderer. Let them just see me. Whatever comes, comes. But I'm going to face it. On my feet, not running through a river. He looked at her for a long, long time. He saw the woman he had first met, the terrified mouse in the saloon, and he saw the woman in front of him, forged in fire and ice. She was magnificent. He slowly, deliberately, put his rifle back together. He nodded once. All right, he said. They want a trial. We'll give them one. He stood up and offered her his hand. But you won't stand alone, I swear to you. Clara, whatever the outcome, I will stand right beside you. She took his hand. The ride to Dodge City was not a flight. It was an advance. They rode side by side. When they reached the edge of the notorious town, it was not the dusty outpost of Sable Ridge. It was a city, loud, crowded, thick with cattle, drovers, and money. They did not sneak in. They rode down the center of Front Street, past the saloons and the gambling halls. They dismounted in front of the marshal's office. Elias tied their horses. Clara, her head held high, walked up the steps and pushed the door open. The marshal looked up, surprised. I am Clara Bellamy, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the small, quiet office. There is a warrant for my arrest. I'm turning myself in. The trial began 3 days later. It was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed, shoulder to shoulder. It was hot, and it smelled of sweat, tobacco, and cheap perfume. The whispers followed Clara as she was led in. That's her, the harlot. Killed Bart Griggs in his own home. The prosecutor was a slick, ambitious man named Rourke. He painted a picture of a conniving, fallen woman who had insinuated herself into a good man's home, only to murder him in cold blood and steal his money. He dragged her past through the mud, calling her a woman of low morals, a woman who had betrayed her benefactor. Clara sat, pale but resolute, and listened. Her defense was a young, overworked public defender who seemed to believe she was guilty, but he had one card to play. He called Elias Trent to the stand. Elias walked to the front, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He looked out of place. A piece of the prairie dropped into a courtroom. He swore his oath, his voice low and steady. Mr. Trent, the defender asked, how do you know the defendant? I met her in Sable Ridge, Elias said, his gaze finding Clara. He spoke to the jury, but his words were for her. I saw a woman, Not like the one Mr. Rourke described. I saw a woman who was hunted, a woman who was afraid of her own shadow, a woman who flinched at a loud noise, and who slept with a knife because she was so used to having to defend herself. The whispering died. The room was silent. Mr. Rourke calls her a woman of low morals. Elias continued, his voice gaining power. I call her a woman who was enslaved, first by one man, and then by the fear of all men. He calls her a harlot. I call her the bravest person I have ever known. She ran from this town to save her life, and she rode back to this town, of her own free will, to face you, because she is done running. He looked directly at the jury. She is a woman who was hunted, who was broken, and who is now loved. You don't see a murderer sitting there. You see my future wife. His words turned heads. The air in the room shifted. The prosecution was rattled. Rourke stood. No further questions for this cowboy. He had one final witness. The prosecution calls Mr. Jeremiah Griggs to the stand. A man in a black suit, Bartholomew's younger brother, walked to the stand. This was it. This was the man who had called it murder. He was here to seal her fate. Mr. Griggs, Rourke said, his voice full of sympathy. Please, tell the court about your brother. Tell them about the woman who took his life. Jeremiah Griggs was a small, nervous man. He looked at Clara, then at the jury, his hands twisting in his lap. My brother, he began, his voice thin. Bartholomew, he was a powerful man, a successful man. And this woman? Rourke pressed. She was his mistress, was she not? Jeremiah winced. He kept her, yes. And she killed him, stabbed him, in cold blood. Jeremiah was quiet for a long time. He looked at the floor. He looked at the judge. He looked at Clara. And his gaze was not full of hate. It was full of a deep, weary shame. My brother, Jeremiah said, his voice cracking, was not a gentleman. Rourke's smile faltered. Sir? He was known, Jeremiah continued, the words spilling out, for his cruelty. He liked to hurt things, animals, people. He took this girl in. When her father defaulted on a debt, he broke her. The courtroom was in stunned silence. I loved my brother, Jeremiah stammered, tears now rolling down his face. But he was a monster. I can't say he didn't deserve what he got. I can't. He might have deserved it. Jeremiah Griggs' testimony was a stone dropped into a still, dark pond. The courtroom, which had been thick with a hot, unified certainty of Clara's guilt, fractured. The whispers that followed were no longer just condemnation, but confusion, argument, and, for the first time, a sliver of doubt. The prosecutor, Rourke, his face pale and tight with fury, had no more questions. The judge, his expression unreadable, banged his gavel and charged the jury. They were led out, and the waiting began. Elias had refused to let Clara return to the jail. Her bail, paid with the last of his cash, meant she was free until the verdict, but she was a prisoner nonetheless. They took a room at a boarding house on the dusty edge of town, a small, square room with graying wallpaper and a single window that overlooked a chicken coop. It was, Clara thought, a different kind of cell. The first day was a low, humming agony. Every footstep in the hall, every raised voice from the street, was the jury returning. Clara paced, 3 steps from the bed to the wall, 3 steps back. Her body was a wire, stretched to the point of breaking. Elias sat in the single wooden chair by the window, oiling his revolver, his hands moving in a slow, methodical rhythm that was the only steady thing in the room. He was oiling a gun that was already clean. They hate me, she whispered, stopping at the window, staring at the dust motes dancing in the weak shaft of sunlight. Some do, Elias said, not looking up from his work. Some hate what your trial showed them, that a man they respected was a monster, People don't like having their world turned upside down. It's easier to hate you. What if they find me guilty? She asked, her voice thin. What if they think Jeremiah lied? That I seduced him too? Then we deal with what comes, he said. He snapped the cylinder shut. But we ain't there yet. Sit. You'll wear a groove in the floor. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting in her lap. The first night was the worst. The sounds of Dodge City, a town that never slept, filtered through the thin glass. A tinny piano from a saloon down the street, a burst of drunken laughter, a single, sharp gunshot, distant and casual. Clara lay on the cot, rigid, staring at the cracked ceiling, her heart hammering at every sound. Elias blew out the lamp. He lay on the bed, not on the cot, on top of the covers. He had not taken off his boots. The darkness in the room was thick and close. I can't sleep, she said, her voice small. No one's asking you to, he replied from the darkness. She began to tremble. It was not the cold. It was the memory of Rourke's voice. Harlot, murderer, conniver. It was the faces of the jury. 12 men, all men, looking at her, weighing her life. She felt the bed dip. Elias shifted, moving from his spot, and lay down beside her, on top of the covers. He did not speak. He just lay there, a solid, warm presence in the dark. After a long moment, his arm moved, heavy and sure, settling over her waist, pulling her back against his chest. I'm here, he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her hair. She did not resist. She leaned into his strength, her fist clenching his shirt. She was not a prisoner alone. She was with her guard, her partner. He held her every night, a silent, living shield against the terror. He held her as the second day passed, and then the third. On the morning of the fourth day, the knock came, not the heavy final knock of a marshal, but a quiet tap. It was the public defender. They're back, he said, his face pale. The walk to the courthouse was a dream. Clara felt disconnected from her own body. The crowd was thicker than before, a silent, tense sea of faces that parted for them. She sat at the defendant's table. Elias sat in the chair directly behind her. He placed his hand on the back of her chair, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat of his knuckles. All rise. The judge entered. The jury filed in. They looked tired. Clara searched their faces, but they looked at no one, their expressions set like stone. Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreman, a hardware merchant she recognized, stood up. He held a single piece of paper. We have, Your Honor, on the charge of murder, in the death of Bartholomew Griggs. How do you find? The air in the courtroom was so thick it was unbreathable. Clara felt her vision narrow, the edges of the room blurring, until the only thing in focus was the foreman's mouth. She felt Elias's hand grip her shoulder, his fingers digging in, grounding her. We find the defendant, Clara Bellamy, the foreman said, his voice ringing in the silence. Not guilty. The words were just air. They did not make sense. Not guilty. He continued, reading from the paper. We find that the defendant acted in justifiable self-defense, given the testimony of her situation and the admission of Mr. Jeremiah Griggs. Not guilty. Clara's mind heard the words, but her body reacted first. The breath she had been holding for her entire life, the tension that had lived in her muscles since she was 16 years old, rushed out of her in a single, tearing sound that was half sob, half scream. The world went black at the edges. Her legs, which had been rigid, dissolved. She did not faint. She collapsed. She fell sideways, off the chair, into Elias. He was there, catching her, his arms wrapping around her as she went down, pulling her against his chest. He held her, his face buried in her hair, his own body shaking with a single, violent shudder of relief. It's done, he whispered, his voice thick. It's done. Clara, You're free!" The courtroom exploded. The judge hammered his gavel, shouting for order, but it was useless. From the back, a cheer. Jeremiah Griggs was weeping openly, but closer. From the gallery, there was a different sound, a roar, an ugly, frustrated sound. A marshal was at their side, his hand on Elias's shoulder. "You best get her out of here. Trent, now, use the back." The verdict was in, but the trial was not over. The town of Dodge City was still angry. They were hustled out, not through the front doors as free citizens, but down a dark, narrow corridor that led to an alley. It was not an escape. It was an expulsion. A group of men, friends of Griggs, cattlemen who had drunk his whiskey and taken his money, were waiting for them, their faces dark with rage. "There she is," one of them shouted, pointing. "The killer whore! They let her go!" "That ain't justice," another roared. "She murdered him. We all know it." They surged forward, a wall of angry bodies. Elias shoved Clara behind him, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. His face, which had been soft with relief, was now a hard mask of cold fury. "The law says it's done," Elias growled. "Step aside." "You and the law can go to hell, cowboy," a man with a scarred face spat. "She's a harlot. She should have hanged." The prejudice had not vanished. It had not been reasoned with. It had just been legally overruled, and it was furious. The back door of the courthouse slammed open, and the marshal stood there, a shotgun held level. "That's enough," he boomed. "The verdict is in. It's over. You men clear this alley, or you'll spend the night in my jail. Get!" The mob slowed, their hatred warring with the sight of the shotgun. They grumbled, they cursed, but they shuffled back, their eyes still fixed on Clara. "You'd best ride. Trent," the marshal said, his voice low. "Ride now, and don't look back. Dodge has a long memory for things like this. You won. Don't push your luck." Elias nodded. He took Clara's arm. She was shaking, the joy of her freedom stolen, replaced by the cold, familiar terror. She was free, but she was still hated. They left Dodge City at the first gray hint of dawn. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. They rode hard, heading back toward the land Elias had bought, a place that seemed like a dream from a different life. They did not go to Sable Ridge. They bypassed the town, giving it a wide berth. When they finally reached his quarter section, the land by the creek, the sun was setting. The ruin of the old sod house was a dark, crumbling shadow. They dismounted. The horses, weary, lowered their heads to drink from the creek. Elias and Clara stood side by side, looking at the empty, raw land. It was nothing but dirt, grass, and a vast, silent sky. "It's not much," Elias said, his voice rough from the trail. Clara took a deep breath. The air smelled of sage and clean water. There were no people. There were no saloons, no courtrooms, no alleys. There was no one to whisper. There was only the wind. "It's ours," she said. The next day, the work began. They did not move into the ruin. They began to build. Elias had his axe, his rifle, and the supplies he had bought weeks before, still stashed and covered. He was a man who had spent his life drifting, but he knew how to build. He knew how to survive. He felled trees by the creek, cottonwood and pine, and the sound of his axe was the first true sound of their new life. It was the sound of creation. Clara had never known such labor. It was brutal, back-breaking, and relentless. Her hands, which had been softened by the weeks of trial, were raw and bleeding within the first day. Elias taught her how to use a drawing knife, to strip the bark from the logs. He taught her how to mix mud and grass for chinking. She hauled water. She learned to cook their meals of beans and game over an open fire. She helped him lift the heavy foundation stones from the creek bed. One afternoon, a log they were raising slipped. It grazed her side, pinning her arm against the new wall. She cried out, a sharp, sudden sound of pain and frustration. Elias was there in an instant, his face pale, leveraging the log away. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight. Her arm was bruised, bleeding, but not broken. She sank to the ground, the strength leaving her, and she began to cry. Not from the pain, from the sheer, overwhelming exhaustion of it all. "I can't," she wept, her face in her filthy hands. "I'm not strong enough. Elias, I'm slowing you down. You should have left me." He knelt in the dirt in front of her. He did not touch her. He just waited until her sobs quieted. Then, he gently took her hands. He held them up, her small, calloused, blistered, and bloody hands. "You see these?" he said, his voice rough. "These are not the hands of the woman I met. These are the hands of a woman who is building her own home. You helped set those stones. You helped raise that wall." He looked her in the eye. "There is nothing stronger on this earth. Now, let me see to that arm. We've got 2 more logs to set before sundown." They finished the cabin in 6 weeks. It was 1 room, with a solid stone fireplace, a real wooden floor, and a door that locked. The night they moved in, they laid their bedrolls by the hearth. Elias lit the first fire, and Clara stood in the center of the room, her hand on the rough log wall. It was solid. It was hers. Life found its rhythm. It was not an easy life. It was a constant, daily struggle against the land, the wind, and the coming winter. But it was theirs. Clara learned. She learned to ride, truly ride, not just flee. Elias took her out onto the high prairie, and they raced. Her laughter, rusty and new, carried on the wind. He taught her to shoot. He put his rifle in her hands. "It's a tool," he said. "Like the axe. You don't have to fear it. You just have to respect it. Use it to provide." The first time she fired it, the kick bruised her shoulder and the noise made her ears ring. But she learned. She learned to breathe, to squeeze the trigger. A month later, she brought down a young buck. She had stood over it, her hands shaking, and wept. Elias had put his hand on her shoulder. "It's the way of it," he said. "We'll eat for a month. You did good." She learned to tan the hide, to plant a garden, to fight the gophers for every kernel of corn. She bought chickens in Sable Ridge, riding in with Elias. The townspeople watched them. Silas Croft saw her and ducked back into his saloon. They were the Trents, the quiet settlers from the creek. They were left alone. The fear began to fade. The ghost of Clara Bellamy, the harlot, the murderer, receded. In her place was a woman with strong hands, sun-browned skin, and clear, quiet eyes. One evening, almost a year after the trial, Clara walked from the creek, her bare feet sinking into the cool earth. The air was warm, smelling of pine and dust. She had been washing clothes, and her hair was unbound, hanging damp down her back. Elias was on the small porch they had built, leaning against a post, watching the stars begin to burn in the deep purple sky. He heard her, the soft pad of her feet on the wood, and turned. He smiled. The haunted look was gone from his eyes. Too, he was no longer a drifter. He was a man who was home. She came to stand beside him, leaning her shoulder against his solid chest. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the sky, listening to the vast, empty sound of the prairie. "You once asked me my future," Clara said, her voice quiet. He looked down at her, his memory drifting back to that dark, desperate morning in the saloon. She gestured with her hand, a small, sweeping motion that took in the solid log cabin, the dark patch of her garden, the horses grazing by the creek, and the endless, starry sky above them. "It's this," she said. He put his arm around her, his hand rough and warm on her bare arm. He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. They embraced as the coyotes began their first cries in the distant hills, their high, lonely voices weaving a song. The prairie wind rose, whispering through the tall grass. A promise of the night. A promise of peace. Later, long after Ellis was asleep, Clara sat at the small table he had built, by the light of a single candle. She took out a piece of paper and a pen. She wrote a letter to a dead man. She wrote to Bartholomew Griggs. She told him about the trial. She told him about his brother. She wrote down all the names he had called her. She wrote down all the things he had done. She poured all the poison, all the shame, all the fear, onto the page. She wrote until there was nothing left to say. When she was finished, she folded the paper. She walked to the hearth, where the embers of the fire glowed red in the darkness. She held the letter to the heat. She watched the corner blacken and curl. She watched the flame catch, hungry, turning the ink in the paper into a bright, curling ash. She watched until every word was gone, until the last whisper of smoke had vanished up the chimney, released into the vast night sky. Elias stirred in the bed. "Clara," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Come to bed." She turned, leaving the last of her past in the ashes. She walked toward the bed, toward the man who was her home. She whispered, to herself, to the quiet, to the wind, "I'm not running anymore." Thank you so much for listening to this story. We truly hope you enjoyed it. Where in the world are you listening from? We would love for you to tell us in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this one. And please share your thoughts with us in English.